I'm a huge geek. Nobody's surprised by that. One of my favorite web comics released a book called Upgoer 5. And the premise of the book was really simple. He attempted to explain really complicated things like a Saturn V rocket using only the 1,000 most common words in the English language. So he had this diagram of the thrusters, and he said, this end should point toward the ground if you want to go to space. If it starts pointing towards space, you are having a bad problem and you will not go to space today. An entire book like that, I really enjoyed it. And I took the same text editor and I went back to my doctrinal statements that I wrote during ordination. And I attempted to rewrite them using common language. Here's the part I wrote on baptism. Going underwater is like being dead, just like God's Son. But he didn't stay dead, and so we don't stay under the water. You should know what it means to go underwater before you do it. Though the book that God wrote doesn't say exactly how we should go underwater, I think it is best to go all the way under because God's Son was all the way dead. Now, I enjoyed the creative exercise of really trying to simplify, these complex statements, but I don't think that any of us can do any better than what Jesus does in the one verse that'll be our anchor text for today in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, as we continue through the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Now, Jesus refers to the entire Old Testament here, and he says, you want to sum up that entire collection of books in one statement, and your obligations to God, he said, do whatever you would wish that others would do to you. In a related passage in Matthew, Jesus is asked what the most important commandment is out of the entire law. And Jesus said, he quotes from Deuteronomy, he said the first and foremost is to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Then he quotes Leviticus, and he says to love your neighbor as yourself. He says the same thing. He says, on these two commandments, loving God and loving others, depend all the law and the prophets. Do you want to change how you read your Bible? Look at the Old Testament through the lens of these two commandments, that we should love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. When I first got this, it made me excited to dig into the book of Leviticus. Most people aren't. But I had to go back. I was like, I want to see if that's really true. And I just went line by line. And which one of those does this go back to? And all of the commandments that God had given his people, all the messages of the prophets, boiled down to those two things. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. So in the Old Testament, for instance, when they're commanded not to charge interest to poor people when they lend them money, well, that's loving your neighbor as yourself. That's doing to them as you'd have them do to you. Deuteronomy 22, some of the really random laws, saying that when you build a new house, on the roof of it, put up a guardrail so nobody falls and hurts themselves. Well, that's loving your neighbor. And then they are to love God. And again, a lot of Christians get hung up on books like Leviticus, but if you go back and look at it, all of the laws and the details around festivals and sacrifice and feasts and the priesthood, God's intention in all of that was to bring the people of Israel into a greater understanding of his character. They showed the aspects of God, his holiness in comparison to our sin, his faithfulness through history. Again and again in the prophets, God spoke to the people and tells them that he has no interest in their just obedience without love. Because all of the law and the prophets depend on loving God and loving our neighbor. So in Isaiah 29:13, he says this people draw near with their mouth and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me. And their fear of me is a commandment taught by men. So even if you were to take and attempt to faithfully live out every commandment of the Old Testament, if it was not motivated in love of God and your neighbor, the entire thing is useless. So let this guide your reading when you journey through the Old Testament. Again, Jesus says, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. This is so beautiful in such a simple way to sum up the whole moral teaching of the Bible in a way that any of my kids could understand. But you might not know this. Jesus here isn't just quoting from the Old Testament. Variations of this same statement are also found in Buddhism, in the writings of Socrates and Islam and other religions. And so sometimes people say, oh, look, you see, all religions are just the same. We shouldn't be surprised to find the most basic concept of morality expressed, no matter who the person is, because the book of Romans says this. He says that the pagan Gentiles, even people who bow down to altars, who sacrifice their kids, even they have an understanding of right and wrong. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Every member of the human race is born knowing, in general, that there's a difference between right and wrong. You ask any 3-year-old on the planet, give their sibling 2 donuts and them 1. What are they going to say? That's not fair. They have an understanding of the way that they should treat others. Now, for the Christian, though, this is not just a summary of, oh, here's how you understand the Old Testament, but Jesus' commandments form the foundation for the way that we live towards other people as followers of Him. In Romans chapter 13, Paul sums up his teaching on why Christians should pay taxes and says, pay to everybody what you owe to them. And that reminds him of something else. Here he says in verse 8, owe no one anything. Man, that's a life goal in itself. A lot of us, right, are drowning in debt. Owe no one anything except to love each other. Now, he's not saying that your credit card company will accept that. You know, hey, how about a warm hug? Owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Twice there he says that when we love other people, we fulfill the law. Remember, the early Christians, huge question for them. We look at the Old Testament. What are we obligated to do? How do Gentiles live in relation to the covenant that God made with the people of Israel? And so what they said in the early church, you put your faith in Christ and you love your neighbor as yourself. That is the fulfillment of everything the law was meant to bring you to. And he sums up the commandments. He references the 10 commandments. And this is a great illustration of it. The 10 commandments. The first 4 are about loving God, right? No other gods, no idols, honor God's name, honor His day. First 4 are about loving God. The next 6 are about loving your neighbor as yourself. Honor your parents. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, and don't covet. Those are all summed up in love God and love your neighbor. So for a Christian, love is not just a summary of the law, it's how we live in obedience to God. And let me tell you, if you want to experience a good life, put this teaching into practice. If you want to have a great marriage, attempt to live this out. Now, I got to put a caveat in there. When Jesus says, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, that doesn't always mean exactly what you might think it might mean in marriage. I'll give you an example. Sarah receives love differently than I do. When I eat a steak, I don't like big gobs of fat on it. I like it pretty lean. Now, if I were to say, some of you are shocked, but that's just... Now, if I were to say, okay, I'm going to do to Sarah as I would like her to do to you, it doesn't mean that I cut all the fat off of all of our steaks, because that's not how Sarah receives love. Her love language is saturated fat and cholesterol. And so ever since we've been together, we've had an agreement that I get the steak, I cut the fat off, and I just put it on her plate. Except now she's got competition with Christine, who has a taste for the same. So we have to consider not just, okay, the exact way that I want to be treated, but in the same way that I would like people to express love to me, to express it to them. Some of you guys would be perfectly content to go an entire week without anybody talking to you. Some of you, that sounds like a vacation. Let me just tell you, your wife might not enjoy that as a gift from you. Like, oh, baby, I would have loved it. Just don't talk. There's another way that we have to be careful as we apply this in marriage. It is not do unto others so that they will do the same to you. Because sometimes, we can do this and put a burden of obligation on the other person, right? Right? You go home, you say, all right, I'm going to clean the whole kitchen, do all the laundry, whatever, and then I'm going to expect something out of her in the next day or two. And here's the truth. In marriage, there will be times when the other person is dealing with an illness or depression or stress or grief, and they will go through prolonged periods where it will not be give and take. It'll be more give. And if you're going through that time, accumulating in your mind all the stuff that they're going to owe you as soon as they're feeling better, you're not walking in love. So it is enough just to love them without expecting in return. If we live this out, if we love our neighbor as ourselves and treat them the way that we would want to be treated, let me tell you, the church will really shine. That happens sometimes. I'll be out in town and I'll be talking to somebody else, and is curious about what church they're going to and how that's going. And sometimes they'll begin speaking to me very negatively about their pastor. And it's really awkward, but I always attempt to, at that moment in the conversation, not necessarily defend the guy, because I don't always know the whole situation, but to try to give him the best benefit of a doubt that I can. You know why? I really hope people do the same with me. When we consider the needs of others. Now, you guys, I think, have been doing an excellent job of this as far as welcoming newcomers, but I want to remind you that if you see somebody walk into this church and they sit down by themselves, in your mind that should be regarded as an urgent need. You remember the feeling of you've gone into a place and maybe you don't know everybody, and it's unfamiliar, and how impactful a single handshake or greeting can be. Go bring them a donut. If we treat others in the way that we want to be treated, it will lead to a much better society. I'm kind of spoiled now because when I go around town now, I'm generally recognized and well treated. Pastors are held in a great deal of honor here in this town, but it's not always been that way in my life. When I was a waiter, when I was a laborer working a shovel, I remember how keenly aware I was of the way that people treated me. From the cashiers in the grocery store when I handed her a soggy $20 bill, and it wasn't because I was swimming, to the people when you'd go and ask them for a drink of water, and they'd either point you to the hose in the backyard or bring you into their house. How do we treat the people around us who live in the margins of our society? If we live this out, we would hope that it would make for better laws in our country. I think our prayer for those in leadership, be it the local or state or national level, would be that when they write the laws, when they govern, that it would be with the consideration not how it will benefit them or even the people who voted for them, but that they would consider everyone that they represent. Loving your neighbor as yourself touches every part of your life. So if you're ever dealing with a situation in your life that the Bible doesn't directly speak to, for instance, the Bible says nothing about driving or traffic. I don't know if donkey jams were a thing back then, which actually sounds like the name of a good country music band, Donkey Jams. But, so it doesn't say anything about how we're to behave in traffic. And yet, when you're leaving the fireworks on July 4th and everybody's trying to merge onto the same road, how many of you let other people in front of you? And how many of you say, well, you should have parked closer to the road? I'm going. In the same way that you'd have other people treat you, treat them. There are also other times where, even when we look at what the Bible says, it is not clear the right course of action that we should take. And when we find ourselves in that position, considering that the law is fulfilled when we love our neighbor as ourselves, should be the basis of making those decisions. A while back, I saw a posting from the local police department of people that were wanted by them for outstanding warrants and other things, and I recognized a name and a face. I knew where the person was. They were wanted for unpaid fines. What was the right thing to do? I really spent a long time, wrestling over that, and as I made my decision, it was with exactly this in mind, not only for the person who was wanted, but for the people who lived around them as well. So in every area of life, in every decision we make, we are to do to others as we would have them do to us. Now, there is an exception here. There's a time when you can do this and be wrong. You may be preparing to give somebody a really big tip, and you may be thinking in your mind, I am motivated by love, because that is the way that I would like to be received, and I'm feeling a great deal of love towards this person. But if you are attempting to tip generously in a strip club, this is not what Jesus had in mind. See, sometimes people will do this. They'll say, well, love is love, and I just happen to love a bunch of women I'm not married to. That's not what Jesus had in mind. You cannot use loving your neighbor as yourself as an excuse to violate a direct command from God. Because remember, the first and the greatest commandment is to love God. Now, love of Him involves obedience to Him. Now, some people might say, well, okay, that's really simple. I mean, love your neighbor as yourself. If that is fulfilling of the entire Old Testament, if that is the summary of all the moral teaching of the New Testament, why isn't the Bible a lot shorter? I mean, if you look at it that way, you could literally just send out a few tweets about putting your faith in Jesus and the cross, and then love your neighbor as yourself, and be done with it. For thousands of years, doctors and nurses have referred to the words of Hippocrates, who said that their entire goal in the medical profession is to do good or to do no harm. Now that's great. Do no harm is a great foundation for medical practice. In fact, pretty much everything they do should draw back to that. But that doesn't mean that we can just burn all of their textbooks. In fact, go to a medical student, right, and tell them, you know what, you can just write do no harm on every one of your exam questions and see how that goes for you. So we understand, even as that is the summary of the entire teaching of the New Testament, we still need to be told specifically the difference between right and wrong, and here's why. We're crooked. This is kind of a running theme in the Sermon on the Mount. I remember learning to navigate using a map and a compass, and being told that there is a difference between the way that compass needle will point, which is magnetic north, and the actual direction of the North Pole, which is true north. And if you don't take into account the difference between true north and the way the compass is going to lead you, you will get off track very quickly. You might not notice the difference right away, but if you go, I think in Missouri, if you go 10 miles, not accounting for the difference, you will end up a mile off course. And so Jesus, again and again on the Sermon on the Mount, is bringing the people to an awareness of the fact that they are not good. Our hearts do not pull us to true north. We've got our own thing going. And some people, it's like you take a magnet there, and you can pull that compass needle wherever you want it to go. And so we're running all over the place, following our own hearts. So what we're going to do is we are naturally going to take this very simple commandment, do to others as you'd have them do unto you, and we are by nature going to find ways to mess it up. You want an example? Because you're all nodding. Everybody agrees. Oh man, love your neighbors as yourself. That's great. What are you going to do when your buddy asks you where your favorite fishing spot is? All of a sudden, everybody becomes a theologian. Coming up with, hold on. You gotta understand, there's this thing. Hold on, let me pull up my notes from the sermon. Pastor was saying something about exceptions. Like, is it loving God more? Yeah, I worship in that spot, so you can't touch it. Love God is the greatest commandment. We're naturally going to pull that compass needle towards ourselves. And so we need to be confronted in specific ways in our lives. I mean, understand, slave owners attempted to justify owning and selling human beings by saying we're just loving them like our neighbors. They tried to say, well, we're giving them a better life than they'd have otherwise. We need to be confronted with the truth of God in all of its detail. We also have an unwritten law that governs our hearts many times, and that we tend to do to others what has been done to us. Very often when people are cruel and obscenely nasty to us, if we were able to look at the details of their lives and the depths of their hearts, we would find a pain there that is being expressed in their behavior towards other people. You know, a dog that's in pain, though it's loved you all its life, might bite your hand. So what I find impressive when we consider this is not the simplicity of, oh, just love your neighbor. I find impressive all the countless ways that we find around it. And here's the thing, and this is the difference between Jesus saying this and Socrates saying it. Because the Christian life is not built on your behavior. The Christian life is not built on the way that you treat other people. It is built on the way that God treated us. Because God looked at us because we don't love our neighbors, because we don't love God. And he gave himself up for us. 1 John 3:16. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. This is what makes it so different when it comes out of the mouth of Jesus, because he himself was the living embodiment of everything that the law could have expressed. And he physically showed us what that love meant by taking our failures on himself. And so I hope that for all of us, in considering this, we are aware, you know what, there's plenty of times, both in the past and currently, that I don't treat other people the way that I should. And if you haven't already come to that point, you've not been listening. And that is precisely the point at which we come before the cross and we find God's unrelenting grace towards us. And so in light of that grace, we understand that God has shown us what that love means. That then forms the motivation and the center of the way that we go out into this world and love other people. So again, I find myself just in awe of God's truth, and that it is something that I could explain and have been trying to explain to Mitchell at 2 years of age. And yet I'm going to spend the rest of my life learning what it means to put this into practice. Let's pray. God, I pray that, first of all, that you would open our minds to understand your word. That we find things both surprising and challenging and convicting. Help us to understand the heart of everything that you are. We are told that God is love. And all your requirements for us, all that you would ask of us, returns back to loving you and loving our neighbor as ourselves. God, I pray that you would not only bring us into obedience to that, but most of all, that you would help us to appreciate the grace and forgiveness that you offer when we fall so very short of that ideal. I pray that our lives at every level, and in our families, in our workplace, in our culture and society, in our nation, that we would be known as people of love. In Jesus' name.
We